Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Combs, and I want to talk about one of the elements of fiction in this video, and that is plot. So, plot is the deliberate and artistic arrangement of events to create a certain effect. Plot relies heavily on cause and effect, and it's different from story, which is simply relating events as they happen. So, if you're telling a story, maybe to your friends or to maybe your boss about why you were late for work. You start at the beginning and usually you just relate events as they happen, right? You tell the story in order. First this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But when an author, sits down to write a short story or a novel, that author thinks about the plot differently. Often authors want to arrange events in a story so that a certain experience is created for the reader. So, as a writer crafts the plot of a work, he or she attempts to convert the chronological arrangement of incidents into a causal and inevitable arrangement. So, what Harmon and Holman are talking about here is in a well crafted plot, the events seem to flow logically. So one event causes the other, and then that event causes another event, and then that event causes another event. And when they say inevitable argument, or I'm sorry, inevitable arrangement, what they're referring to is the fact that, at least traditionally in stories, authors wanted to write such that the result of the story or the ending of the story is the only possible ending given the series of events that led up to it. We refer to that sometimes as a tight plot. If the plot is tightly constructed, that means that the only outcome is the outcome that occurs. Now, in modern and contemporary stories, probably from the mid uh, probably from the 1930s to today, many authors have played around with and experimented with not having their novels and short stories so tightly constructed, right? So we may read some stories in this class where everything doesn't seem to work out, or there's a twist ending or something, right? And that's okay if done effectively. All right. But usually the writer attempts to present events in such a way that the outcome seems natural, plausible, and logical. If an author relies too heavily on chance or coincidence, or uses too many tricks on the reader, so a trick might be, let's say you have a gambler jump to his death from a cliff to escape the mob boss who is demanding repayment of money he had loaned him. And right before he hits the ground, the gambler wakes up and realizes, oh, the incident had all been a dream, right? If you do things like that, or if the writer does things like that, he or she can insult the basic intelligence of the reader. So the reader knows something up. You, as a reader, know when you have been tricked or when something doesn't flow logically. And I'm sure you can think of books that you've read, television shows you've seen, or movies where something happens at the end that doesn't fit with the rest of the movie, or there's something that's too much of a coincidence, or something that's a little too convenient. And one of the things that I can think of most recently is the series Game of Thrones, what I thought was an excellent series up until the very end when Daenerys hears the bells ring and then, I don't know, it triggers something and she goes crazy. That seemed very out of character for her. She had been so, I think, throughout the series, so controlled and so restrained and formal that seemed very out of her character, and it also just seemed out of sorts with the rest of the series, right? And a lot of people actually talked about that. And so if you've watched Game of Thrones, that was probably a time when you thought, hey, this doesn't seem right. It sort of takes you out of the takes you out of the being immersed in the show, right? And you sort of think, hey, this doesn't really fit. So when that happens, if you've experienced that, then that's probably the plot not being as well developed, the writers not developing the plot as well. So some writers of good stories do use chance and coincidence effectively. However, these writers ensure the reader never feels taken in. And that's a fine line. It's hard to do sometimes to create a plot that is totally believable, natural, plausible, and logical. So I want to take a look at a video. This is sort of a video within a video. So the following video compares a weak plot to a stronger one. And this is a very simplistic view of a good plot and a bad plot. Maybe overly simplistic, but I think it will help me get the point I'm trying to make across. So let's watch this video first, and then we'll talk about it. So this is the bad plot. Joe goes for a walk in the woods. He enjoys his leisurely hike. He surveys the plant and animal life around him. He finishes his walk and goes home. Okay, so this is the good plot. Joe goes for a walk in the woods. Before long, he comes across a snake that strikes at him from the side of the trail. He narrowly escapes the snake and hurries down the trail, only to find himself a few feet from a black bear. He manages to sneak away without gaining the bear's attention. But as he continues down the path and comes to a crossroads, he discovers that he dropped his map during his flight and now has no idea which way to turn. So, the second story is indeed better than the first. The first story simply relates events as they happen, but in the second story, the author artistically arranges events to show the reader a small threat first, so a snake that you could probably easily escape or defeat. Then the author shows the reader a larger threat, the bear, which cannot be as easily escaped or defeated. And finally, the author shows us arguably the largest threat, being lost in the woods with snakes and bears. Also notice the author doesn't tell the reader about the lost map until it will have the most impact in the story, the point when Joe comes to a crossroads and needs it. The author does rely on a chance meeting of a bear and a snake, but this is plausible to me because those animals do live in the woods. If the author had written that Joe ran into a walrus, for example, it would not be as believable or logical to the reader. Now, the second story about Joe's walk exemplifies another important aspect of the plot, and that's the conflict. The conflict is a struggle between two opposing forces. Conflict is central to the plot of a fictional work. Most often, a story's plot involves resolving the conflict in some way. So, in a lot of stories, the conflict will be resolved. Now, in modern and contemporary stories, sometimes the conflict will not be resolved, or it will not be resolved in a satisfying way. But most often, at least in traditional stories, whatever the conflict is, it is resolved in some way by the end of the story. Short stories can include many conflicts, but usually they focus on one or two major conflicts at most. And conflicts can be categorized into two general types. You have external conflicts. Those are struggles between two outside and separate forces. And internal conflicts, and those occur within a character's mind. So, external conflicts can be further categorized as person versus person, person versus nature, and person versus society. And usually we refer to internal conflicts as person versus self. So let's think about a few examples of each of these. So person versus person. Think about He-Man versus Skeletor, right? Just two opposing outside forces going at each other. Dennis the Menace versus Mr. Wilson. Or the vampires versus the Lycans from the Underworld film series, if you've watched that series. So, person versus person. We also have person versus nature. So think about the films Jaws or Twister or Jurassic Park or Pompeii. In Jaws, you have a beach town where the people are pitted against this great white shark. In Twister, it's tornadoes. In Jurassic Park, it's dinosaurs, even though they were created by science and created by man, these particular dinosaurs. Once they are born, they just act as dinosaurs do, right? And then in Pompeii, you have the people of Pompeii who are trying to flee or deal with the eruption of the volcano Mount Vesuvius. I also think about the second story about Joe. He runs into a snake and a bear, right? The interesting thing about person versus nature, I think, is that usually nature isn't good or evil. Now, you might make a case that Jaws is evil. It's been a while since I've seen the film. But, you know, people may think Jaws is evil. I mean, but really, Jaws, the shark is probably just being a shark, right? The tornadoes are certainly not evil or good. They're just doing what tornadoes naturally do. Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs are not evil or good. They're just basically being dinosaurs, right? So when you think about person versus person, usually we're on one person's side because they are the good character, and then the other character or the person that is the opposing force is the bad character. Now, in some stories that becomes complicated, but in the stories that have the conflict person versus nature, basically nature is just nature. It's not bad or good. It doesn't have any morality. So that makes, I think, sometimes for an interesting story. And then you have person versus society. So if you've seen the movie Django or Django Unchained, I always mess up pronouncing this name because I don't know, should I pronounce the D? Should I pronounce it really well? Should I pronounce a little bit of the D? So it's Django or Django. But this is a movie starring Jamie Foxx, if you remember. And it's about an African American character who is moving through the world in the 1800s in America, and either slavery is still in practice or it's very soon after slavery had been abolished or been made illegal. So you have this black character who is going through society, and he must deal with the way his society views black people, right, or African Americans. Also think about Merida from Brave, the Pixar film. She doesn't want to be betrothed, even though it's her society's custom, right? That a princess is betrothed to some boy that she will grow up to marry. And there's a whole festival and competition where young men compete to determine who will be her husband, but she doesn't want any part of it, right? So she is turning against her society's custom or her society's tradition. So you can have stories where people versus society. And then if you think about person versus self, this is a conflict, remember, that's within a person's mind. There's some struggle within a person. For example, think about Anakin Skywalker from the movie Revenge of the Sith. So in this movie, the young Jedi must decide if he will serve the powers of good or turn to the dark side. So the conflict, even though there are other conflicts in that movie, I think the main conflict is the conflict of what side will Anakin choose? What path will he go on, right? And that is a conflict that happens within Anakin. So let's practice a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a situation, and I want you to tell me what conflict or what type of conflict is represented in each of the following situations. So you might want to get out your journal, or you might want to get a piece of paper, something to write with, and just jot these down as we go along. So I think I have 8 of them. So let's look at the first one. If the Titanic had only proceeded more slowly, if she had only taken the southerly route, avoiding the icebergs, if only the watch had had a pair of binoculars. What is the main conflict? Now, there may be a few conflicts, or at least, 2 in some of these, but think about the main conflict. What is the main conflict being described? Well, here I think the main conflict is person versus nature. So the captain of the Titanic and the other crew members are dealing with the crash against the iceberg, and then the crew members and the passengers are dealing with the cold, icy waters as the Titanic sinks. So the Titanic situation is definitely person versus nature. So what about this next one? Charles decided to break all the rules the day he decided to steal that car. He was immediately arrested and sent to jail to await his trial. He should have known better than to mess with the rules. Well, if you said person versus society, I think you're exactly right. There might be some person versus self where he decides to break all the rules, right? So that was a conflict within himself. But the main conflict being described is the fact that he is breaking the rules. So society has laws. Charles decided to break them. So person versus society. So what about this next one? I don't care who you talk to, screamed Sarah to Rick. I just wish I had never met you. Well, if you said person versus person, I think you're correct. We're not sure what's going on between Sarah and Rick, but there is a Sarah, there is a Rick. So I think it's 2 outside forces that are opposed to each other. And finally, on this slide, Steve is struggling to find a job after serving a 5-year jail sentence for being an accessory to an armed robbery. So I think this one is person versus society, because he's struggling to find a job after being in jail. And what Steve is up against is basically society's view of those who have had prison time, right? And this is a very real situation. A lot of times, people, after they have been to prison, no matter what the crime was, and no matter that the person has done their time and is ready to come back out and be part of society, a lot of times those who have been in prison cannot find jobs, even when there's not an official rule against hiring someone at a certain company who has had done prison time. Some people just personally don't want to hire people who have been to prison. So that's a societal view, and I think Steve is up against that one. All right, let's look at 4 more. So Gerald's new hot-tempered stepfather is making his life miserable. Person versus person, I think, right? Gerald versus his stepfather. So Sandra is ashamed of her Mexican heritage. She views herself as a freak and an outcast. Now, I think the main conflict here is person versus self because Sandra is ashamed of her Mexican heritage. However, if you had said person versus society, I think that there might be a case for that as well because why is Sandra ashamed? Probably because she lives in an area where people look down on her Mexican heritage, right? Which they shouldn't for any reason. So I hope Sandra in this story can overcome that. But person versus self is what I think. But you could also make a case for person versus society. And then Anne's school has a state level ice hockey team for boys. When Anne and a group of her friends want to start a girls' hockey program, she's told that although it's a nice idea, hockey is too dangerous for girls. So I think this one is person versus society. So the person or the people actually are this group are composed of this group of girls who want to play hockey, but they are told hockey is not a girl's sport. So that's a societal view. So this is person versus society. It's also person versus person, whoever's telling Anne, maybe the school board or the coaches, that she can't play hockey. But the fact that they say hockey is too dangerous for girls, that's sort of a view that a community might have. So I think that's person versus society. If you said person versus person, you can make a case for that too. And then finally, in The Water Boy, Bobby Boucher, a sheltered mama's boy, must decide whether to disobey his mother and play football or obey his mother and remain the water boy for the team. This is for sure person versus self. He has to decide if he's going to disobey his mom or not. So let's do some other practice. What I want you to do is identify the main conflict in this story excerpt. And well, there are a few conflicts. Identify a few of the conflicts, and then afterwards we'll talk a little bit about what conflicts that I have seen in this. So, after lowering himself into the damp and dark cave, Tom began to reprimand himself for not having replaced his flashlight batteries. Tom's terror slowly began to take over as the light around him grew dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. After the light in the cave was completely gone, Tom began to stumble through the cave blindly, cutting his hands on what appeared to be sharp rocks. As he made his way through the cave, he thought about the conversation he had with his mother before he set out on this adventure. She had been upset that he wanted to skip college in order to go splunking in all the world's greatest caves before he turned 30. Tom didn't understand the big deal. He didn't really believe in structured learning anyway. So think about the conflicts that are present in this excerpt. Write a little bit about what conflicts you see. Okay, I hope that you have written about the conflicts that you see in this excerpt. So, a few of the things that I see, first of all, as he's lowering himself into the damp, dark cave, he began to reprimand himself. So, that's Tom versus himself, right? So, there's a small conflict there. He's wishing he would have replaced his flashlight batteries, and he's sort of saying, yeah, I should have done that. So, that's a small person versus self. Then he gets into the cave. The light grows dimmer. The light's completely gone. He begins to stumble through the cave blindly, cuts his hands on rocks. So the cave and rocks, that's nature. So I see that as person versus nature. He thinks about a conversation he had with his mother, where she had been upset that he wanted to skip college in order to go cave exploring or spelunking. That's person versus person. And then he doesn't understand the big deal because he doesn't really believe in structured learning. So college is not for him, even though his mother and society in general thinks that pretty much everyone should go to college these days. So I think that's person versus society. So if you saw other conflicts in there, that's fine too, as long as you can back those up with evidence from the story. So anytime, and that goes for anything in this class. Um, your answer is correct as long as you can back your answer up with evidence from the story. As long as you can explain to me why you said a certain answer and give me information from the story or the poem or the play to back it up, your answer is just as good as anyone else's. All right. So the plots of most works of fiction follow the same general outline, and this general plan is best mapped out using a diagram called Freytag's pyramid. And Gustav Freytag, there's a picture of him. And he was a German novelist and playwright who lived from 1816 until 1895. And he developed his pyramid, which he wrote about in his 1863 book, Technique des Dramas, or Technique des Dramas. I'm horrible with pronunciation. To describe the action of a 5-act play, right? But scholars and teachers have found that this pyramid can apply to novels, short stories, and even some narrative poems as well. So this is Freytag's pyramid, and usually it looks like this. And you have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement, or the resolution. And the denouement is a French term that we use for the ending of a story. The exposition basically is the background information. The rising actions are the actions that lead to the climax, and then the falling action is what happens after the climax. So, the exposition, as we said before, contains introductory material, often creates the tone, it introduces the setting and characters, and supplies other facts necessary for understanding the narrative. The rising action is where the complication or explanation and development of the conflict is introduced. So here's where we learn what the actual struggle is. And the climax basically is the point where the struggle is resolved. And we had said before that sometimes the struggle isn't resolved, especially in modern and contemporary stories and plays. So there are a few ways we can think about the climax. The climax is the point of most interest in the narrative. So it's the point of most interest. It's the point where the conflict is resolved in some way. It sometimes is referred to as the turning point, since it is the point at which the conflict's resolution is inevitable. So if you remember, at the climax, the story can only go one way after the moment of climax. So the following action happens after the climax, and during the falling action, if I said following action, I meant to say falling. During the falling action, the narrative begins to wind down, and the denouement, sometimes referred to as the resolution, is simply the end of the narrative. So let's take a look at some familiar stories mapped out on Freytag's pyramid. And if you want to draw sort of Freytag's pyramid as you're reading short stories and indicate what parts are the exposition, what parts are the rising action, what parts are the climax, etc., that might be a good idea. So let's take a look at some familiar stories mapped out on Freytag's pyramid. So if you've watched a film version or you've read Stephen King's Carrie, then this plot will be familiar to you. So Carrietta, or Carrie White, it's her last name, lives with her abusive mother, Margaret, a religious fanatic. So that's what you get at the beginning of the story. So, abused at home and at school, Carrie discovers that she has telekinetic powers. So, the rising action is that she has an abusive home life, she's picked on at school, but then she discovers that she can move things with her mind. She has these powers. So, at her high school prom, she is humiliated by having pig's blood poured over her. And at that moment, she decides to get revenge, right? So, that is the climax. The moment where she gets revenge, the moment where she decides to get revenge, the moment where she thinks, this night was going great, maybe life is good, maybe things are not so bad, but then the pig's blood, and she thinks, no, things are really as bad as they seem. These people really are out to make fun of me. So that's the climax. Now, the falling action, the aftermath of that is that she uses her powers to kill everyone, basically. So, after she is humiliated with the pig's blood, the only possible solution is for her to go crazy. That makes sense with the story, right? Because the story has been building up to this moment. She kills the students who tormented her, she kills her mother, she destroys the town, and then at the end, Carrie dies of a heart attack calling for her mother. What about The Wizard of Oz? So, background information: Dorothy feels lonely, neglected, isolated on her Kansas farm. She wants adventure, she wants an exciting life. So, so that's the background, the exposition. The rising action: she goes to Oz, she's at odds with the Wicked Witch of the West. She is accompanied on a quest by three companions who, like her, seek to gain the aid of the Wizard of Oz. The moment of climax: Dorothy melts the Wicked Witch, claiming her broomstick, which she needs to gain the wizard's favor. And so when the wizard can't help her, Dorothy calls on Glinda, who tells her how to transport herself home, and then Dorothy awakens in her home, in her bed, surrounded by her family, whom she now appreciates. So, what I want you to do now is think of one of your favorite stories and outline it using Freytag's pyramid. So, think of your story and tell me what the exposition is, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement of your story is. This could be a film, it could be a television show, maybe a season of a television show, or it could be a just one episode, or it could be a book. But one of your favorite stories, and think about it for a little bit, and tell me the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. All right. I hope you thought about one of your favorite stories. Now let's finally look at two techniques related to plot that writers sometimes employ, and those techniques are flashback and foreshadowing. So, a flashback is a device by which a work presents material that occurred prior to the opening scene of the work. So, a flashback, basically, I'm sure you're familiar with these. It's showing you something that happened before the story or the novel opens. Um, so you go back in time, you see something that happened before the present. So, according to Daniel and Saphir, often a flashback is needed to make the present action more understandable to the reader. An author can introduce a flashback in several ways: a dream sequence or a character's memory, for example. And flashbacks are especially important and useful when a story begins in medias res. And basically, in medias res is always italicized for some reason, maybe because it's Latin, but it's just Latin for in the middle of things. So, something that begins in medias res begins not at the beginning, but in the middle. And then you learn about how things got started in flashbacks. So a lot of times, and one of my favorite television shows does this a lot. Which is Supernatural. So a lot of times, Supernatural will open with some crazy thing going on that you would think, oh gosh, how did this happen? And then the next scene will say, 2 weeks later, or not 2 weeks later, but 2 weeks earlier, or yesterday or something. So when something opens or begins in medias res, it just means you're already in the middle of things and you have to go back through a flashback to discover what happened or how things got the way they are. So an example of this is Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. It tells the story of the Trojan War, and basically it opens during the last year of the Trojan War and uses flashbacks to tell us how the war began. So remember Tom, who wanted to explore caves rather than attend college? While Tom is in the cave, the story flashes back, right, to tell the reader about a conversation he had with his mother. So J.K. Rowling ingeniously uses a magical device, the pensieve, to show flashbacks in her Harry Potter series. So I have this scene here, where Harry Potter is looking into the pensieve and he sees a memory, and it gives us, the reader, some information about what's going on. I guess Voldemort is back, but this is showing us a memory from when Voldemort had gained power the first time around. So let's take a look here.
Professor? Igor Karkaroff, you have been brought from Azkaban at your own request to present evidence to this council. Should your testimony prove consequential, council may be prepared to order your immediate release. Until such time, you remain in the eyes of the ministry a convicted Death Eater. Do you accept these terms?
I do, sir.
And what do you wish to present?
I have names, sir. There was a Rosia. Evan Rosia.
Rosia is dead.
Dead?
Yeah, he took a piece of me with him, though, didn't he?
I didn't know.
If that is all the witness has to offer...
No. There was Rockwood. He was a spy.
Augustus Rookwood, of the Department of Mystery.
Yeah, the same. He passed information to you-know-who from inside the ministry itself.
Very well. Council will deliberate. In the meantime, you will be returned to Azkaban.
No! Wait, please, I have more! What about Snape? Severus Snape.
As the council is very much aware, I've given evidence on this matter. Severus Snape was indeed a Death Eater, and prior to Lord Voldemort's downfall, turned spy for us at great personal risk. Today's no more a Death Eater than I am.
Remains faithful to the Dark Lord.
Silence! Unless the witness possesses any genuine name of consequence, this session is now concluded.
Oh, no. Heard about one more.
What's that?
The name.
Yes?
I know for a fact this person took part in the capture, and by means of the Cruciator's curse, torture of the Auror Frank Longbottom and his wife.
Name! Give me the wretched name!
Barty Crouch! Junior.
Get your filthy hands off me, you pathetic little man! Hello, Father.
You are no son of mine.
think about all of the information that you gain about the present from that flashback. So, flashbacks, when done well, are great tools to give the reader much needed information. Let's also talk about foreshadowing. So, foreshadowing is the use of clues to suggest events that will happen later in the story. Writers often use foreshadowing to increase suspense. Now, suspense is the uncertainty or anxiety that a reader feels about what will happen next in the story. When something is very suspenseful, you're always wondering what will happen next, right? And you're always sort of thinking about what will happen next. And you're eager to know what will happen next. So, suspense makes the story exciting. It makes the reader want to read more to find out what will happen. So, foreshadowing allows the reader to attempt to guess what will happen next in the story, and it increases that suspense. So, for example, in Jurassic Park, Dr. Grant has some fun terrorizing a bratty little boy with a raptor claw, telling him, "You stare at him, and he just stares right back." And that's when the attack comes, not from the front, but from the side. So, this foreshadows the actual hunting technique the raptors, use to take down Muldoon. Another example might be when Ruth Jones' alarm clock woke her. I'm sorry, let me start over here. When Ruth Jones's alarm clock woke her at 7 o'clock that morning, she had no idea today would be the longest day of her life. So, the longest day of her life, if you start a story that way, that's foreshadowing because it makes me as a reader want to know, well, why is this the longest day of her life, right? What about this situation? Fred left the house at 11 o'clock and drove into town. He was meeting his father for lunch at Brown's. Officially, they were just catching up, but they both knew Fred needed money again, and not such a small amount this time either. So this creates some questions in my mind. Will his dad give him the money? Will Fred bring up the fact that he needs money? And why not such a small amount? What has happened? What has Fred gotten himself into? So that creates suspense. That is foreshadowing. It makes me eager to know what will happen next and gives me a hint about what will happen next. So let's look at a version of Little Red Riding Hood and identify some examples of flashback and foreshadowing that you see. So, once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother. Her mother asked her to take her old and lonely grandmother some food one day. "Don't stop along the way. Go straight to your grandma's house and back. Don't talk to any strangers, and watch out for the wolf in the woods. Now get along." While the girl was walking through the woods, a wolf was walking past her. I bet I could convince her to take the long way. Then I could get to her grandmother's house first and trick her into thinking that I am her grandma. That way, I could have her and her grandma for a large feast, he thought. The wolf went up to Little Red Riding Hood and told her he knew a shortcut. Little Red Riding Hood thought back to what her mother told her. Don't talk to any strangers and watch out for the wolf in the woods. But it was too late. She had already listened to the wolf's directions. Think about an example of flashback and foreshadowing that you see. Well, I think that when her mother tells her not to talk to strangers, that this is an example of foreshadowing. You might guess that she will meet a stranger on her journey, right? And I think that when she thinks back to what her mother had told her, that's an example of a flashback. All right, here are the resources I used when creating this presentation. So I hope you found this helpful, and I will talk to you next time.